A racist white woman humiliates a black man on a plane. She is later shocked to discover the real identity of the black man. The bustling terminal of Los Angeles International Airport was filled with the usual mix of hurried travelers, echoing announcements, and the sounds of rolling suitcases. It was a typical Wednesday morning, and for Elijah Brooks, it was another day of traveling for work, though he preferred to keep a low profile about the specifics of his job. As a black man in his early 40s, Elijah had grown accustomed to the mixed reactions he received from people on flights, especially when he settled into his usual spot in first class. Dressed in a neatly tailored gray suit, Elijah looked as unassuming as possible. With neatly trimmed hair and a soft, warm smile, he moved through the airport with an ease and confidence that caught some glances. This trip to New York was for a special reason, though the others around him didn't know it. Elijah was the CEO of an acclaimed tech company that was pioneering artificial intelligence for healthcare, making an impact that reached far beyond the usual corporate achievements. But he didn't think of himself as anyone special. He was simply a man who'd worked hard for his success and loved every bit of it. As Elijah approached the boarding gate, he heard his seat number called and boarded with the first-class passengers, quietly finding his way to seat 2A. Once seated, he took out a book, prepared to relax for the 5-hour flight ahead. Elijah was one of those people who preferred his own company during flights, but his peaceful journey was soon interrupted by an arrival that would change everything. A few moments later, a woman in her late 50s made her way down the aisle, looking around with a critical eye. Pamela Banks, with her meticulously coiffed blonde hair and designer handbag swinging by her side, was the epitome of privilege. Dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer and pearl necklace, she held an air of entitlement that made her presence hard to ignore. Pamela was on her way to New York to attend an exclusive charity event. Her life had always been about connections, social events, and luxury, and she carried herself with the firm belief that she deserved nothing less than the best. As she approached her seat 2B, her eyes fell on Elijah, already settled in the window seat. For a brief moment, Pamela's expression betrayed surprise, followed by a hint of annoyance. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she took in his presence. "Excuse me," she said with a forced politeness that only barely masked her disdain. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Elijah looked up, his expression calm and collected. "Yes, I'm in 2A. Your seat is 2B, he replied, gesturing to the seat beside him. Pamela frowned, glancing back at the flight attendant nearby as if expecting someone to address what she viewed as a mistake. Instead, the flight attendant simply smiled and gestured toward the seat, confirming what Elijah had said. Pamela settled into her seat, visibly unhappy. She glanced over at Elijah again, her gaze lingering on him as if trying to decipher what he was doing in first class. Unable to hide her displeasure, she let out a loud sigh, adjusted her seatbelt, and pulled out a glossy magazine. The plane taxied down the runway, and as the engines roared to life, Pamela's irritation only seemed to grow. Elijah, on the other hand, was entirely unbothered, his attention focused on his book. Pamela, however, wasn't finished with her silent protest. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Elijah to hear. He didn't look up but gave a small smile, wondering if she'd continue to test his patience. After takeoff, the flight attendants began serving drinks and snacks. Pamela wasted no time ordering a glass of Chardonnay, hoping it might ease her annoyance. She watched as Elijah declined the drink service, opting instead for a glass of water. "So," she said after a few sips of wine, clearly unable to restrain herself any longer, "are you traveling for work?" Elijah nodded, remaining polite. "Yes, I am," he replied, offering no further details. Pamela's eyes narrowed, her curiosity mixed with suspicion. "In first class?" she asked, her tone edged with disbelief. Elijah nodded again. "Yes, I travel often, so it's convenient." Pamela let out a short, derisive laugh. "Convenient. Right," she replied, her words laced with condescension. She leaned back, folding her arms, and muttered something under her breath about how anyone can get into first class these days. Elijah took a deep breath, deciding not to respond. He'd experienced this kind of judgment before, and he wasn't about to let it ruin his day. But as the flight went on, Pamela's actions became harder to ignore. As the flight progressed, Pamela continued to cast glances at Elijah, each one more pointed than the last. It was clear she was struggling to contain her displeasure, and finally, after the attendants served lunch, she could no longer hold back. Pamela leaned over, her voice dropping but her words filled with disdain. "I'm sorry, but it's just unusual to see someone like you in first class." Elijah's calm demeanor remained, though a spark of disappointment flickered in his eyes. He set down his book and looked at her, his voice steady. "Someone like me?" he repeated, his tone firm but unthreatening. Pamela shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing the implications of her words. "I didn't mean anything by it," she stammered. I mean usually, people who look like they belong here. Well, you know." Elijah shook his head. "I'm afraid I don't," he replied, his gaze steady as he waited for her response. Pamela flushed, embarrassed but still defiant. "I'm just saying it's unexpected, that's all. You probably worked very hard to afford a seat like this, didn't you?" Elijah sighed, giving a tight smile. "I suppose you could say that." A few passengers nearby glanced over, sensing the tension. Pamela's voice had grown louder, and her tone had drawn attention. Emboldened by her small audience, Pamela continued, her voice dripping with insincerity. "Well, good for you then," she said, leaning back with a smirk. "It's always inspiring to see people who manage to make something of themselves, even with all the challenges they have to face." Elijah's expression hardened, but he maintained his composure, refusing to give her the reaction she seemed to want. He returned to his book, making it clear he was done with the conversation. But Pamela wasn't finished. She turned to the woman seated across the aisle, an older woman named Gloria, who had been listening with growing discomfort. "Isn't it something?" Pamela said to Gloria, waving a hand toward Elijah. "You never know who you're going to end up sitting next to on flights these days." Gloria, a dignified woman with silver hair and kind eyes, looked at Pamela with disapproval. "Yes, indeed," she replied coolly. "You never know who you'll meet, or the surprising things you might learn if you listen." Pamela blinked, surprised by the rebuke, but Gloria simply turned away, returning to her own book, leaving Pamela to stew in her frustration. The remainder of the flight continued with an air of awkwardness. Pamela tried several times to engage other passengers, attempting to gather sympathy for her frustration. But most passengers were clearly uncomfortable with her attitude and ignored her attempts. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom with an update on the arrival time and weather in New York City. Elijah prepared himself for landing, relieved the tense flight was nearly over. But just before they touched down, Pamela turned to him one last time, her tone even more condescending than before. "I hope you enjoyed your little taste of first class," she sneered. "I'm sure it's not an experience you'll have very often." Elijah met her gaze, his calm smile returning. "You'd be surprised," he replied simply. Pamela's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, the plane landed, and the flight attendants announced they could begin gathering their belongings. Elijah stood, calmly retrieving his carry-on, while Pamela hurriedly gathered her things, eager to disembark. As they exited the plane, Elijah prepared himself for the next phase of his trip. He knew that this encounter wasn't over yet, and the look on Pamela's face would soon change when she saw him again in an unexpected place. As the passengers disembarked, Pamela was quick to grab her designer handbag and make her way toward the front, eager to leave the flight and Elijah behind. She felt a sense of triumph, as though she had somehow put him in his place with her condescending remarks. She barely glanced at Elijah as she hurried down the jet bridge and into the bustling terminal of John F. Kennedy Airport. Elijah, however, took his time, smiling at the flight attendants as he thanked them before stepping out into the terminal. He wasn't fazed by Pamela's behavior. He'd experienced enough of these encounters in his life to know how to handle them. And today he knew something she didn't, a piece of information that would turn her assumptions upside down. As Elijah made his way to the baggage claim, he took out his phone and checked his calendar. His schedule was filled with meetings and events, But the most significant one was coming up shortly, a charity event at the prestigious Lexington Grand Hotel, where he'd be the keynote speaker. He glanced around, mentally preparing himself for what he knew would be a busy day. Meanwhile, Pamela was also headed to the Lexington Grand, where she planned to attend the same charity event. She had spent months planning her attendance, hoping to make a big impression on the influential attendees. Little did she know, she was about to make an impression for all the wrong reasons. Later that evening, the Lexington Grand Hotel was a sight to behold. Its grand ballroom was filled with New York's elite, adorned in designer gowns, tuxedos, and sparkling jewelry. The ambiance was one of elegance and sophistication, with chandeliers casting a soft glow over the guests as they mingled and enjoyed the evening's festivities. Pamela arrived in a dazzling silver gown, her head held high as she moved through the crowd, greeting people she recognized and making small talk. She felt entirely in her element, surrounded by those she considered her social equals. In her mind, she was exactly where she belonged. As she scanned the room, Pamela overheard several guests speaking excitedly about the evening's keynote speaker. They mentioned his reputation as a visionary in technology and healthcare, as well as his commitment to using his influence to support underprivileged communities. Pamela was intrigued. She hadn't read much about the speaker, but his name, Elijah Brooks, sounded vaguely familiar. "Do you know who the speaker is tonight?" Pamela asked an acquaintance, a woman named Sandra who was also a regular at these events. "Oh, Elijah Brooks is incredible," Sandra gushed. "He's the CEO of one of the top tech companies in the country, and he's been making waves with his groundbreaking work in healthcare. I heard he's even being considered for several awards in philanthropy. He's changing lives, really." Pamela raised an eyebrow, surprised by Sandra's enthusiasm. "Really? He sounds impressive," she said, though her tone carried a hint of skepticism. Sandra nodded. "And I heard he's very down to earth. You'll see when he speaks." As the guests began to take their seats, Pamela found herself wondering who this Elijah Brooks really was. She'd seen plenty of successful people at these events, but it was rare to hear anyone described with such admiration. Her curiosity was piqued, though she still assumed he was just another business executive trying to make a name for himself. The lights dimmed and the host of the evening took the stage, welcoming everyone to the event and expressing gratitude for their support of the charity. After a brief introduction, the host announced that it was time to introduce the keynote speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our honored guest, a leader in technology and a true philanthropist, Mr. Elijah Brooks." Pamela's applause faltered, her hands freezing mid-clap as she watched a familiar figure step onto the stage. Her mind raced, her disbelief and embarrassment slowly dawning as she realized who Elijah Brooks truly was. The man she had looked down upon and belittled on the plane was none other than the very CEO she was about to hear speak. The realization hit her like a wave, her stomach twisting as Elijah took the microphone, his gaze calm and composed as he scanned the crowd. For a brief moment, his eyes met hers, and though he didn't show any sign of recognition, Pamela felt as though he was looking right into her soul. Elijah began his speech, his voice steady and resonant as he spoke about his journey in the tech world, his company's mission, and his vision for using technology to improve access to healthcare. He spoke passionately, sharing stories of how his company's innovations had helped people in underserved communities, and how he hoped to inspire others in positions of privilege to make a difference. The audience listened in rapt attention, captivated by his words. Pamela, however, sat frozen, her face pale as she replayed their conversation on the plane, over and over in her mind. The weight of her actions sank in deeper with every word he spoke, and she couldn't shake the feeling of shame that now consumed her. As Elijah concluded his speech, the room erupted in applause. Pamela joined in, though her clapping was half-hearted, her mind still reeling from the shocking turn of events. When the applause died down, Elijah stepped down from the stage and began mingling with the guests, graciously accepting congratulations and answering questions. Pamela hesitated, debating whether she should approach him. Part of her wanted to apologize, to explain herself, but the other part dreaded facing him after everything she had said. She looked around, hoping to avoid him, but fate had other plans. As Elijah made his way through the crowd, he ended up near Pamela's group. Sandra, still beaming from his speech, introduced herself and Pamela. "Elijah, this is Pamela Banks, a dear friend of mine," Sandra said, gesturing toward Pamela. Elijah extended his hand, his expression neutral but polite. Pamela forced a smile as she shook his hand, struggling to maintain her composure. "It's a pleasure to meet you," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah held her gaze for a moment, his eyes betraying a hint of recognition. "I believe we've already met," he said, his tone even. Pamela's face flushed and she glanced around nervously, noticing that a few nearby guests were watching the exchange with interest. She tried to laugh it off, though her voice wavered. "Yes, I believe we crossed paths earlier," she managed, her forced smile barely masking her discomfort. Elijah didn't press the issue, but his silence spoke volumes. He gave a polite nod and turned his attention to other guests, leaving Pamela standing there, feeling exposed and humiliated. The rest of the evening was a blur for Pamela. She avoided eye contact with anyone and spent most of the time at the edge of the room, sipping her drink and trying to regain her composure. The more she thought about the encounter, the more she realized the gravity of her behavior. Her assumptions and words on the plane had not only been inappropriate but deeply prejudiced, and now, in the presence of Elijah Brooks, she was forced to confront that reality. As the event wound down, Pamela saw Elijah standing near the exit saying goodbye to guests. She knew this was her chance to address what had happened, to try to make things right. Summoning her courage, she approached him, her heart pounding. "Elijah, Mr. Brooks, I wanted to apologize," she began, her voice filled with uncharacteristic humility. "I'm embarrassed about the way I spoke to you on the plane. It was wrong of me, and I didn't realize who you were." Elijah listened, his expression thoughtful. "Pamela," he said, "it's not about who I am or what I do. It's about treating everyone with respect, regardless of their appearance or background." Pamela nodded, her cheeks flushed with shame. "You're absolutely right. I was wrong, and I regret it." Elijah's gaze softened slightly. "I appreciate the apology, Pamela, but remember, everyone you meet deserves respect, not just the people you think are worth your time." With that, he offered her a small, forgiving smile before turning away, leaving her to reflect on his words. The ride back to her hotel was a silent one. Pamela stared out the window, her mind racing as she replayed her conversation with Elijah. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of shame and guilt press down on her, suffocating in its intensity. She realized that her actions on the plane and her reaction at the event reflected the worst parts of her. And now, she had been called out on it by none other than the very person she had belittled. Returning to her room, Pamela sat by the window, unable to shake the haunting feeling of regret. She thought of her life, how often she had dismissed people, judged them by their appearance, and assumed their worth without knowing a thing about them. She thought back to moments where she had behaved similarly, realizing that her actions had likely left others feeling hurt and diminished, just as Elijah must have felt on the plane. In the dim light of her hotel room, Pamela had an unsettling revelation. Her wealth, her status, and her connections had all insulated her from accountability. No one had ever confronted her like Elijah had. It was a harsh truth, but it was one she couldn't ignore any longer. The next morning, Pamela decided to reach out to Elijah one last time. She composed a carefully worded email, apologizing sincerely and thanking him for his patience. It was a genuine apology, not for her benefit, but because she understood the hurt she'd caused. As she wrote, Pamela didn't expect forgiveness. She knew it wasn't Elijah's responsibility to make her feel better. She was simply grateful for the chance to acknowledge her mistake. A few days later, she received a reply from Elijah. It was brief but thoughtful, thanking her for her message and expressing hope that she would continue to reflect on her actions. Pamela felt a sense of closure, but also knew she had a long way to go. She'd taken the first step, but she was determined to work toward becoming a better person. A person who treated others with respect, no matter their status or appearance. In the weeks that followed, Pamela's life began to shift. At social events, she found herself questioning her assumptions about others and actively working to engage with people from different backgrounds. She found herself listening more, seeking to understand rather than judge. It was a new experience for her, but one that brought her a surprising sense of fulfillment. Her friends and family noticed the change, some even commenting on how she seemed softer, more understanding. Pamela knew it would take time, but she was committed to making these changes permanent. She took up volunteer work and joined organizations that promoted inclusivity, using her resources to support initiatives that aligned with the values she was beginning to adopt. Months later, Pamela attended another charity event, this time with a new perspective. She was no longer there to impress others or secure connections. She was there to listen, to learn, and to support the cause. As she moved through the crowd, she spotted a familiar face, Elijah Brooks, standing near the stage, surrounded by admirers. Pamela hesitated, uncertain if she should approach him, but just as she turned to leave, Elijah noticed her and offered a small, knowing smile. She returned it, grateful for the unspoken understanding between them. Later that evening, Elijah approached her, extending a hand. "It's good to see you here, Pamela," he said warmly. Pamela accepted his handshake, smiling genuinely. "Thank you. I've been working on myself," she replied, her voice filled with humility. Elijah nodded approvingly. "That's good to hear. Real change takes time, but I think you're on the right path." Pamela felt a sense of validation she hadn't expected, knowing that Elijah had seen her efforts. In that brief moment, she realized that her journey toward humility and understanding was far from over, but she was willing to keep going. Pamela's encounter with Elijah had changed her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. She continued her work, joining boards of organizations that promoted social justice and supporting causes that aligned with her newfound values. Her wealth and influence became tools for positive change, and she used them to uplift those around her. Though she still struggled with her past behaviors at times, she now approached each day with an open heart, grateful for the lesson Elijah had taught her. It was a lesson in humility, respect, and kindness, a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. As for Elijah, he continued his work in technology and philanthropy, leaving a legacy that went beyond his company. His quiet strength and compassion had made a difference in Pamela's life and countless others. And though he didn't seek recognition, his influence extended far beyond the business world, inspiring change in unexpected places. Pamela's life became a testament to the power of accountability and self-reflection. Her friends and acquaintances noticed the changes, some even finding inspiration in her transformation. She became known not just for her social status, but for her compassion and integrity, a reputation that brought her a sense of fulfillment she had never felt before. And though she would always remember the plane ride that started it all, Pamela felt grateful for the experience. She had learned a valuable lesson, one that had humbled her and shaped her into a better person. In the end, both she and Elijah had found peace, each in their own way. Their paths had crossed for a reason, and the impact of that encounter would ripple out, touching lives and inspiring others to embrace kindness and understanding. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more interesting and captivating racial discrimination stories.